This is just an introduction to three designs illustrating some of the everyday business of Raphael's workshop in the early 1510s. They help document the early work of that most problematic of Raphael's assistants, Gianfrancesco Penni, and they've been largely overlooked since the mid-19th century. Today there's time only to present the images, leaving full discussion for later, but I hope at least to persuade you that Franz Kugler was wrong to dismiss them back in 1836 as pretty but essentially meaningless. I'm very grateful to the organisers for their kind invitation, and particularly to Paul Joannides, who so kindly showed me the first image some time ago. First, a very brief reminder of Penni himself. Here in Giulio's drawing for the Vatican Sala di Constantino, authenticated as his portrait by Vasari, top right. Appropriately, he appears in the fresco as the emperor's right-hand man, just as I suggest, Giulio's portrait appears on the opposite wall as the emperor's crown prince, bottom right. Second, Penni's graphic style, at the surviving core of which are a large group of multimedia modelli or ricordi, like the two in the centre. This isn't the occasion to go into precisely which drawings are Penni's and which might be copies, still less into the boundary between Penni's work and his colleagues. I think that as many as 100 or more drawings deserve serious consideration, and for today, at any rate, three or four are quite enough. Among the earliest certainly attributable to him and datable from what we know of the Raphael commissions, and not solely from stylistic evidence, were these two designs of around 1514, 1515, for the Sistine St. Paul in Athens on the left and a discarded version of the Bologna St. Cecilia on the right. The St. Paul documenting Penni's intermediary role as Vasari's il fattore, developing Raphael's core idea for the main figures at the top into usable product for the studio. So, it was interesting when this characteristic Penni drawing was exhibited for the first time last year, apparently after a Raphael-like design conceived several years before, 1514-15. Its materials, manner, and function are typically Penni. Soft, careful, rather decorative penwork, extensive wash and heightening, and the lively effect of what is, after all, basically a development of a pre-existing idea made for transfer. It was known early in the 19th century when Johann Passavant also recorded the indented copy at Windsor on the left, conceivably by Penni too, and there's also a rather later etching for the mass market in the centre, and an intermediate engraving might also have existed. We've also got a very small panel painting, all but identical to the drawings, which was attributed to Penni long ago by two shrewd early scholars, Passavant and Gustav Wagen. It reappeared recently and is quite likely an early work of his. Its concept and manner are almost Florentine. The face is close to the muses in the Parnasso, particularly to Clio, top left, as in Raphael's drawing in the centre. In other words, the design something of an echo of Raphael himself around 1510 or a bit earlier. It had worked well as one of Hesiod's muses, or as an illustration of the Homeric epithet kalisfuros, that is, beautifully ankled. But in fact, its combination of attributes, tripping, dance-like motion, semi-transparent skirt raised in the left hand, and the right arm extended, offering a flower, identify it as a Roman personification of a civic virtue, spes or hope. One might perhaps wonder instead whether it's merely a general conceit, like that myriad of mobile Quattrocento women inspired by different classical prototypes. The triumph of chastity at the top is typical, as is Perugino's Venus and his Sibyl. The pose is natural enough, familiar to us from operatic curtain calls. and it can emerge from random dancing, as these 19th century studies show. But there's an obvious taxonomy in such images, from the broad category of nymphae to Warburg's Fraulein Schnellbring, to our type as a particular subspecies. What one might call its complexity of correspondence is specific not to the usual Christian allegory of spiritual hope, here bordering one of Raphael's Sistine tapestries, but to the highly political Roman spes, known from many imperial coins from Claudius onwards and from a few gems. She was one of those many virtues given divine honours through a state cult in Rome. Her particular power and public message related to hope in the political future, for example, through a new regime or a new heir. A commonplace sentiment, perhaps, but though it's a common image in ancient Rome, it's relatively unusual in the Renaissance. Such coins could have been sufficient inspiration for our design. The early 3rd century example, bottom left, is quite close. But the plasticity of our drawings suggests a further inspiration. In statuettes like the 3 at top right, they're a common late Hellenistic, early imperial type reproduced in a plethora of objets d'art, a minority identifiable as spes. They played upon much older, archaic Greek images made for quite different purposes, like the 2 top left, excavated in the 19th century. Evidence from early 16th century Rome is scarce, except, just perhaps, for this truly monumental example restored in the 1550s as Flora. As drawn unrestored 20 years earlier by a Flemish visitor to Rome, sketches 1, 3, and 4, it works rather better as spes, though the loss of the hands makes certainty impossible. Van Heemskerk's study suggests that he found it visually interesting, but there aren't many such Renaissance images. One, from an earlier generation, is in this procession of Petrarch's heroines, one of the 3 distinctive leading figures who seem to represent the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, more or less in their canonically correct colours. This otherwise rather odd figure is in the right position for Petrarch's hope, and it's reasonable to see it as a knowing reference to the Roman spes. The other early echoes I know are around Raphael. On the right, sensibility in his early Dream of Scipio, which doesn't have all the attributes, and on the left, the numismatically correct spes of circa 1518 and the Vatican Loggia. I hope today might reveal more examples. So much for the visual evidence. As to what was intended by this resurrection of a rare Roman image, the designer seems to have had 3 purposes: a visual allegory of Christian hope made in a fresh way, developing a graphically interesting image from the past, and above all, perhaps, referring knowingly to the Roman image for a self-consciously learned audience. In other words, a Renaissance viewer would have understood our image to embody both poetic and scholarly, Christian and classical, spiritual and political resonances. The particular point of spes, though, was her promise of charismatic leadership, as could have been known by any reader of, say, Livy on Scipio, Cicero on Pompey, or even Cicero on his own son, Spes Reliqua Nostra. It's perhaps remarkable that this pagan image survived into the very different world of the 1550s. Here, a theologically immaculate sentiment is conveyed through an exact copy of a pagan virtue, superficially sanitized by relabeling. For, of all things, the self-presentation of a hardline Pope, Paul IV, best known as founder of the Roman Inquisition and of the Index of Prohibited Books. We should perhaps see this as evidence of how difficult it was for a well-educated Italian of Raphael's generation, Paul was after all only 3 years younger, to get such imagery out of his system. 2 more such classicizing designs seem to originate from the same source as our spes at much the same time. First, this indented drawing in New York on the right. It too is typically early Penni, drapery, penwork, wash and heightening, as proposed by Popham and Wilder. The design was used later for two engravings, the prime one by Agostino Veneziano, top left, dated 1516. It's another rarely depicted subject. The backstory to the Sibyl of Cumae, who resists seduction by Apollo at great cost. Rare, but easily accessible to readers of Ovid in the many editions then available in Italian as well as in Latin. These images again recall Christian qualities in a classical poetic guise, since this Sibyl was regarded not only as an allegory of chaste fortitude and prophet of the Incarnation, but also as an inspiration to writers or musicians who aspire to the Muses, as in the rather attractive early example on the left. The idea was remade by Raphael's former associate, Marcantonio Raimondi, in the 1520s. Bartsch calls the middle one Hope, but I think it fits better in this set of three images as Faith, with Hope on the right, though they're all but interchangeable. Now, our last design. On the left, for long known only through this photograph and a related drawing. The painting was once paired with our Spes, and it's just resurfaced. So we have a good image of its present condition. There's also this drawing of similar size, indented for transfer. And this one, in the Sistine border, with a second pair of children. It could be read simply as charity, as on the left, canonically correct and contemporary by Andrea del Sarto, or these two on the right from Raphael's workshop, the lower one circa 1520 in the Constantino, a development of the earlier one intended for the Sistine Chapel. But I'd suggest, as Gustav Wagen and Antonio Capellan supposed, that it reads more naturally as yet another rarely depicted story from Ovid, that of Latona, the mother of Apollo and Diana in Lycia. This would explain the prominent lake, the single pair of children, and maybe even the home-like head. The gilded vegetation, which is rather like our Spes, the Edinburgh Passeggio, and the Cava dei Tirreni Tondo, is typically, though not exclusively, Penni, as is the haunting landscape, ancestor perhaps to those ethereal landscapes in the exhibition that I associate with Penni, and also the mother's face, though overall the picture's less accomplished than other paintings attributed to him. Nor is the drawing as typically his as the others are. It's in grey ink and wash, whereas he mostly uses brown. The penwork is spare and economical, where he's generally more decorative and flowing. And the composition is square, where he is usually softer and more rounded. Panzi and Gier call it an anonymous copy, probably rightly. But some of its puzzling features could be explained as an echo of a sculptural model. Not of Latona, usually shown fleeing from Juno, but of Roman Earth Mother divinities like these on the right, from the Ara Parcis, discovered much later, of course, or in the center, Peace holding wealth. So, we've got three Raphaelesque designs of virtues all the like, all roughly contemporary, made circa 1510, 1513. All unusual subjects, ambiguously classical and Christian, and all on a modest scale. I won't indulge in that extreme blood sport described by John Pope Hennessy as aggressive iconography. But we should perhaps still ask the same question as the statesman Talleyrand did when an ambassador dropped dead in mid-negotiation. I wonder what he meant by that. My suggestion lies within the culture of classicizing rhetoric, visual as well as oral, Of those literati with whom Raphael and his associates spent so much time in Rome, the circles of Tommaso Inghirami, bottom right, Fabio Calvo, Johann Goritz, and the rest, remembered elegiacally by some, but all condemned by Erasmus, half seriously, as Ciceronians. This was a sociable, learned, and politically aware world of poetic symposia, modelled perhaps on Horace's Convivia, and of antiquarian debate, which supported their day-to-day duties as well as providing relief from them. In this, they and their arts were very much like their counterparts in faraway China, at exactly the same time, though on a much smaller scale, and in a far less complex way, since the Chinese used learned images not only to support the existing regime, but also to subvert it. One might call their characteristic taste, mindset, and method, and our images, political antiquarianism. For them, conveying a straightforward religious or political sentiment in an out-of-the-way classical form wasn't simply an admirable intellectual conceit. It was almost a professional obligation. To embody Christian sentiments in the archaeologically correct forms of imperial Rome, since the papacy looked to Constantine almost as much as to Peter. As John Ruskin put it, they use such classical images not only as pre-Christian, but as the foundation of Christianity. Of course, classicizing rhetoric is a leitmotif across the courts of Europe over many generations and in the service of various causes. But this Christian classical link was, unsurprisingly, a Roman speciality, reaching a crescendo of sermons, poetics, images, and pageantry under Julius II and Leo X. Most suggestive are the great political festivals staged in Rome between 1492 and 1550. Their designers working with similar ideas to our images on a larger scale. There's some difference between those staged under Leo and the rest. Generally, the symbolism was fairly basic and overtly political, as in the celebratory carnival procession staged to entertain the dying Julius in 1513. But Leo and Inghirami, and to a lesser extent their contemporary Paul III, advised by Latino Giovenale Manetti, used more sophisticated allegories, more like the subtle dynamics of our three designs, with an intellectual range and depth that one doesn't really find again in this sort of context until sometime later, in France around 1550. The best documented case is Leo's inaugural Possesso procession from the Vatican to the Lateran, i.e. from Peter to Constantine, on 11 April 1513, just a few months after Julius's carnival. Its mentality is very close to our designs, without, of course, necessarily using them. The only firm visual evidence is that the biographical subjects under this fourth Possesso arch were used again 2 years later in the Sistine tapestries. Unfortunately, this suggests that it's more likely than not that the images of the theological virtues on the arch were as orthodox as those we now see on the tapestries, and not classical metaphors like our designs. Likely, but by no means certain, what was appropriate and decent for the Pope's great chapel wouldn't necessarily apply to this ostentatiously classicizing street event. Leo, who was an obsessive devotee of hunting, music, and other arts, in other words, of Diana, Apollo, and the Muses, was repeatedly presented in the Possesso decorations as another Apollo. That is, we might say, as Latona's son, the Sibyl's inspiration, and cultivated Rome's hope for the future. In particular, an ambiguous charity Latona would have appealed not just to Leo's taste for learned wit, but also to his obsession with autobiography, evident on both the 1513 arch and the Sistine tapestries. We heard yesterday about his interest in horoscopes, and this extended to a superstitious belief that the 11th of the month was especially important for him. He'd probably have relished a knowing allusion to the story of Apollo's mother. Like him, she rose from being a hunted refugee, in his case after defeat at the Battle of Ravenna, just a year before his election, as well as from Florence much earlier, to that of a quasi-divinity, supposedly inaugurating a new golden age of Apollo. In the same way, Leo's Roman carnival, early in 1514, had no fewer than 18 floats, illustrating his supposed virtues, led by Hope, though probably not our one, and finishing with Eternity, supported, of course, by 2 lions. These events are probably just a bit too late to be the origin of our designs, which stylistically fit better maybe a couple of years earlier, though they would have been an appropriate use for them. The Spes and the Sibyl embody ideas as relevant to the regime of Julius as to Leo's, but a charity Latona is a bit more difficult. I think that it would apply just as well to Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, refugee from Florence, as it does to the same man after his election as Leo X had fulfilled his hopes and aroused the hopes of cultivated Rome. So I suggest that our 3 designs were probably intended for and inspired by literati with a taste for expressing moral or political sentiment with a learned twist through unusual classical forms. Like the Roman images, they echo so self-consciously. They appropriated ancient ones made for other purposes, adapting them to contemporary needs. Though minor things, they deserve to be a bit better known, as evidence for the workshop's early involvement with a larger but still sophisticated market of literati who identified with the aspirations of those at the top of Roman society, whom Raphael served personally, whom the literati also served, advised, and inspired, sometimes through images like these, and literati with whom, according to Castiglione, Raphael and his close pupils associated as equals. Thanks very much.